Ahoy, matey! You may want to sit down louder for this story. For this story is about piracy, about treasure, and about greed. This story is like none other told. This story, What did you say? You said I look ridiculous. No. You think so? You don't like the beard? You're a hater. I'll be back. Snoopy doesn't approve. But stay tuned. Stay tuned. So the story that I was going to tell you before I was rudely interrupted is about piracy, treasure, violence, and the greed of man. You're probably thinking I'm talking about treasure such as gold coins, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. The treasure that I'm referring to is another high commodity, especially at that time, which is the oyster. The oyster was very sought after. It is the story of the Oyster Wars. So in the years after the Civil War, the Chesapeake Bay oyster was one of the most valued commodities on the Atlantic coast. As oystermen competed to harvest the most oysters, it became a big issue. Everyone was trying to get as many oysters as they possibly could, because at that time, the oyster industry was a multi-million-dollar business, and everyone wanted their fair share of the fortune. But the problem is, who decides what is fair and who would even want to share? Okay? Which is a problem, which is called the tragedy of the commons. All right? You have a limited amount of resources, and everyone wants that resources. But if no one's sharing, if everyone's trying to take as many resources, which in this case the oysters, if everyone's trying to take all the oysters, then you're going to have issues, because one, the resource is going to be depleted, it's going to go down, there's not going to be enough resources for everyone to share, and everyone else thinks, well, if they're going to take all the resources, there's going to be hardly anything for me, so I have to take more than I would usually take, and that is what happens, okay? That's exactly what happened. So before you know it, you're having battles and conflicts between all these different people trying to harvest the oysters. So the dredgers were first brought to the bay in 1808 from New England. So they had a new type of way of harvesting oysters. They had what's called the dredge, which basically they could come down and there's like this big machine that could scrape up all the oysters on the oyster bed. Okay, they can do it much faster. But the other people, they just had little hand tongs that they would use to harvest the oysters. Now the difference between the hand tongs and the dredge is the hand tongs, you can pick up a few oysters, but you're not going to pick up many. But with the dredge, you can come down and you can pick up several oysters. So people from New England would come down to the Virginia and Maryland area and see if they can get in on the fortune, because they basically dredged all and harvest all the oysters up in their area. So you had the bigger boats, which were able to dredge, and then you had the smaller boats that had the hand tongs. Now this became a very big issue, because the people who had the dredges just came by and took up all the oysters before the people who used the hand tongs could. So they became very angry, and they started fighting one another. And so Maryland had to pass a law basically saying the larger boats were confined to areas of open waters, okay, the deep water. That's specifically for the people who had the bigger boats. But the people who had the smaller boats, who used the hand tongs, they were confined to the shallow areas, okay? But the people on the bigger boats, they said, hey, we don't like that, because it was a lot more difficult to harvest oysters in the deeper waters. So they said, you know what? Forget that. I'm going to do what I want because I want money so I can feed my family. And I don't really care if I take more than I'm supposed to. So come nightfall, the bigger boats came by and they would take from the little boats. Okay, so they would come by and they would dredge in the shallow waters. And as you could imagine, this made the hand-tongers infuriated. This made them so mad because they're taking all the oysters from them. And so at that moment in time, everyone was coming out of the Civil War, so everyone had guns and they were not afraid to use them. So the small hand-tongers got their guns and they started shooting at the larger boats. And before you know it, conflict between the large boats and the small boats was getting out of hand. People were fighting one another for the oysters. They wanted access to the oysters. So by 1868, the conflict had grown so bad, Maryland decided to create an oyster navy to maintain order on the bay. And also, Virginia soon followed Maryland's example and established its own enforcement fleet. So now you have the oyster navy trying to maintain order on the waters between the large boats, aka the pirates, and the small boats, okay, because they were fighting one another. But long story short, neither the pirates nor the small boats could keep up with the Oyster Navy because the Oyster Navy, they had more ammunition, they had more weapons, and they just had more resources than the larger boats and the smaller boats. So, they finally, put an end to all of that madness and mayhem. But it did carry on for quite some time. A lot of violence, people did die over, the desire to gather more oysters. And that's basically what we're talking about, is about the tragedy of the So the main issue of this story is about greed. Okay? Everyone taking more than they're supposed to, not really caring how that's going to affect other people. And so there's a saying that says, what's good for all of us is good for each of us. I hope you enjoyed this story. It's always exciting when I tell it. I think it's really cool. Do you like it, Snoopy? Okay. Thank you for sharing. I sometimes value his opinion. It depends. But thank you for joining me. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Bye.